At 2300 hours on November 14, 1942, the radar operators aboard USS Washington tracked 9 Japanese warships moving through the darkness. The enemy force was invisible to the naked eye in the pitch-black waters north of Guadalcanal. But on Washington's SG radar screens, every ship appeared as a distinct green blip, their positions updated with every sweep of the antenna. The Japanese fleet, still relying on searchlights and binoculars, had no idea an American battleship was watching their every move. For many months, the crew of Washington had trained with this revolutionary technology. The SG surface search radar could detect ships at ranges that seemed impossible to fathom. The Mark III fire control radar could track targets and calculate firing solutions in complete darkness. Together, these systems gave Washington the ability to fight blind, to kill what she could not see. But in late 1942, few in the Pacific Fleet truly believed a battleship could win a modern naval battle. That assumption was about to cost American lives. The admirals called battleships screening vessels, floating anti-aircraft platforms, expensive escorts reduced to protecting carriers. Official doctrine stated that battleships were obsolete, relegated to throwing up flak, while carriers did the real fighting. Since Pearl Harbor, the fast battleships had been kept on a tight leash, forbidden to seek surface engagements, restricted to defensive roles. Washington had crossed the Atlantic, served with the British Home Fleet, transferred to the Pacific, and in all that time had never once fired her main battery at an enemy warship. Tonight, that would change. Tonight, one ship and one admiral would prove that battleships, properly employed with the right technology, could still dominate a naval battlefield. But first, the thousands of Americans aboard Washington would have to survive what was about to become the most violent surface action of the Pacific War. The battleship was not the problem. Washington was a masterpiece of American engineering. Her main battery consisted of powerful 16-inch guns and 3 triple turrets. She was heavily armored, fast, and could absorb punishment. But in the twisted logic of contemporary naval doctrine, she was considered too valuable to risk in the very role she was designed for, ship-to-ship combat. 3 nights earlier, the cost of that doctrine had been paid in blood. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan had led a task force into these same waters to intercept a Japanese bombardment force. His ships included several heavy and light cruisers and multiple destroyers. It should have been a powerful force, but Callahan had no battleships. The Navy had exactly 2 operational battleships in the entire South Pacific theater, Washington and South Dakota, and they were being held back with the carrier Enterprise. Doctrine said carriers were too precious to risk. Battleships existed to protect carriers, so Callahan went in without them. The result was catastrophe. In a confused night action, Callahan's force stumbled into a powerful Japanese bombardment group in the darkness. The Japanese had 2 battleships, multiple cruisers, and numerous destroyers. What followed was not a battle, but a barroom brawl with naval guns. Ships fired at point-blank range, unable to distinguish friend from foe. American ships shot at each other. When the smoke cleared, Admirals Callahan and Scott were dead. Multiple American destroyers and cruisers were sinking or sunk. Hundreds of Americans were dead. The Japanese had lost only a handful of destroyers, though one of their battleships was crippled. Admiral Chester Nimitz, sitting in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, read the after-action reports with growing alarm. The Marines on Guadalcanal were barely holding on. Henderson Field, the airstrip that made Guadalcanal worth dying for, was under nightly bombardment. Now, intelligence reported another, even larger Japanese force heading south. A Japanese admiral was coming with a battleship, multiple heavy and light cruisers, and numerous destroyers. Their mission was to pound Henderson Field into rubble, then cover the landing of thousands of fresh Japanese troops. If they succeeded, Guadalcanal would fall, the Marines would be slaughtered, the first American offensive of the Pacific War would end in disaster. Nimitz faced an impossible choice. Doctrine said, "Never risk battleships without carrier support," but Enterprise was damaged. If Nimitz held the battleships back to screen the carrier, Henderson Field would be destroyed, Guadalcanal would fall, and months of blood and sacrifice would be wasted. If he sent the battleships forward alone, they might all be sunk, leaving Enterprise defenseless. Every principle he had been taught said this was wrong, but the Marines were out of time. Nimitz made the hardest decision of his career. He ordered Admiral William Halsey to release the battleships. Send them in alone. Let them fight. Ship to ship, doctrine be damned. The man chosen to lead this desperate mission was Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, Jr. At 54 years old, Lee was an unlikely warrior. Short, stocky, and perpetually disheveled, Lee looked more like a rural schoolteacher than an admiral. His uniforms never fit right. He wore thick glasses. He spoke with a Kentucky drawl that made other officers underestimate him. But behind that unimpressive exterior was one of the finest tactical minds in the United States Navy. Lee was a marksman without peer. He had won multiple medals in shooting events at the Olympics. He could put multiple shots through the same hole at long range. He understood ballistics the way musicians understand rhythm, instinctively, perfectly. When he transitioned from rifles to naval guns, that intuition came with him. A 16-inch naval rifle was just a very large rifle to Willis Lee. The principles were the same, but Lee understood something even more important than gunnery. He understood technology. Specifically, he understood radar in a way that most admirals in 1942 did not. While his contemporaries treated radar as an interesting novelty, Lee recognized it as a revolution in naval warfare. A ship with radar could see through darkness, through smoke, through rain. It could track targets at impossible ranges. Most importantly, it could allow one ship to dominate a battlefield where the enemy was fighting blind. For months, Lee had been drilling his crews relentlessly on radar-directed gunnery. He redesigned Washington's fire control procedures from the ground up. In the standard Navy system, information passed through multiple middlemen. Lee eliminated them. He had the radar operators wired directly to the gunnery officer and gun directors. It was a system that had never been tested in combat. Lee had developed it through hundreds of hours of drilling. Now he would find out if it worked when it mattered. Lee's task force was designated Task Force 64. It consisted of his flagship Washington, the battleship South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. On paper, it looked impressive. 2 of America's newest battleships, with a destroyer escort. In reality, it was a scratch team that had never worked together. South Dakota's crew was green. The 4 destroyers had been pulled from different task groups. There had been no time for exercises. The problems went deeper. Washington and South Dakota had incompatible radio systems. Lee discovered this only after they were already at sea. He had to jury-rig a communication plan using signal lights and predetermined maneuvers because the ships literally could not talk to each other reliably. As the sun set on November 14th, Lee took his small force around the western tip of Guadalcanal. The 4 destroyers led in column formation, followed by the 2 battleships, with Washington leading South Dakota. The column stretched for miles, heading into waters that had already claimed dozens of American vessels. The sailors had taken to calling it Iron Bottom Sound. As they rounded Savo Island, every man aboard could see the oil slicks and debris from Callahan's battle 3 nights before. Bodies still floated in the water. Lee knew what he was heading into. The Japanese admiral was bringing the battleship Kirishima, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and dozens of battles since. With her were multiple heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and numerous destroyers, over a dozen ships total, each one trained in night fighting. Each one armed with the Long Lance torpedo, the deadliest torpedo in the world. One hit could break a cruiser in half. The Japanese had been training for night surface combat for decades. Their lookouts were selected for superior night vision. Their torpedo tactics were refined to perfection. They had proven their superiority in night combat again and again. American sailors had learned to fear the night. The darkness belonged to the Japanese. But Lee had something the Japanese did not expect. He had radar, and more importantly, he knew how to use it. As Task Force 64 moved through the Sound, Washington's radar operators tracked every contact. They could see the mountains of Guadalcanal and Savo Island. Most importantly, they could see the Japanese coming from miles away, far beyond visual range. Radar detected the first enemy ships, a group of destroyers sweeping ahead of the main force. The range was closing. Lee faced a critical decision. He could open fire at maximum range, using his radar advantage to hit the Japanese before they knew he was there. But that would reveal his position and possibly allow the Japanese admiral to escape. Or he could wait, let the Japanese commit to their attack run, let them get close enough that they could not escape, then spring the ambush. It was a terrible risk. The closer the Japanese got, the more likely they would spot the American force. If they saw Lee's ships first, If they launched their torpedoes first, Task Force 64 would be annihilated. But Lee understood something crucial. The Japanese were not looking for a surface engagement. They were expecting anything but American battleships. Halsey had kept the battleship movement so secret that even many American commanders did not know they were coming. Lee bet everything on Japanese overconfidence. He ordered his ships to hold fire and maintain course. The range closed. On Washington's bridge, men could hear their hearts beating. The radar operators called out ranges in hushed voices. At a certain point, Japanese lookouts should have spotted the massive silhouettes of two battleships, but the Japanese were looking toward Guadalcanal, expecting to see the flashes of their bombardment. They were not looking behind them. Lee could wait no longer. He gave the order to open fire. Washington's first salvo erupted into the night. 9 16-inch shells arced through the darkness toward a light cruiser. The shells were radar-directed, aimed at a target the gun crews could not see. The salvo took seconds to reach the target. It missed, but not by much. Giant columns of water erupted around the ship. Her captain, realizing he was under fire from heavy guns, immediately ordered evasive action. But Lee was not focused on her. She was a distraction. Washington's radar had identified a much more important target, a destroyer leading the Japanese van. The second salvo shifted to her. This time, Washington's guns did not miss. At least one 16-inch shell slammed into the destroyer. The effect was catastrophic. The shell punched through her hull, detonated in her engine room, and blew her machinery spaces apart. The destroyer went dead in the water, burning furiously. The night exploded into chaos. South Dakota opened fire seconds after Washington. The American destroyers charged forward, trying to get into torpedo range. Japanese star shells burst overhead, bathing the Sound in greenish-white light. Searchlights snapped on, probing the darkness. Every ship was firing at something. It was Callahan's battle all over again, except this time, the Americans had radar. Then, disaster struck. South Dakota suffered a massive electrical failure. Her chief engineer, trying to correct a minor problem, accidentally threw the main circuit breakers. Every electrical system on the ship died instantly. Lights went out. Radar screens went black. Gun directors lost power. In seconds, one of America's most powerful battleships was reduced to a floating target. The Japanese pounced on the crippled battleship. Searchlights from Kirishima and the cruisers locked onto South Dakota, illuminating her like a stage performer. Every Japanese ship that could bring guns to bear opened fire. Shells from Kirishima slammed into South Dakota's superstructure. Shells from the heavy cruisers ripped through her upper works. In a short, violent period, South Dakota took numerous hits. Her radio antennas were shot away. Her radar was destroyed. Dozens of sailors were killed or wounded, including her captain. The American destroyers were faring even worse. They had charged into the Japanese formation trying to launch torpedoes, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One was the first to die. Caught in a crossfire, she was hit repeatedly. Shells ripped through her thin hull, starting uncontrollable fires. Her captain ordered abandoned ship, but before most of the crew could get off, her magazines detonated. She disappeared in a ball of fire. Another destroyer went next. She managed to launch several torpedoes, but before she could turn away, Japanese return fire found her. Shells smashed into her bridge, killing her captain. More shells hit her engine room. Then, a long lance torpedo slammed into her hull amidships. She broke in half and sank in minutes with heavy loss of life. A third destroyer was hit by a torpedo that blew her bow completely off. Somehow, she remained afloat, but she could no longer fight or maneuver. The last destroyer still operational was burning from multiple shell hits. Her captain made the bitter decision to withdraw, picking up survivors as she retreated. In less than 15 minutes, Lee's destroyer screen had been annihilated. Lee's task force had effectively ceased to exist. 4 destroyers were sunk or crippled. South Dakota was blind, deaf, and on fire, limping away from the battle. Of the 6 ships that had entered Iron Bottom Sound, only Washington remained operational. She was alone, facing over a dozen Japanese ships, including a battleship, multiple cruisers, and several destroyers. Every War College scenario said Lee should withdraw immediately. He was outnumbered over 10-1. He had no support. No one would blame him for saving his ship and crew. But Willis Lee looked at his radar screen and saw something the Japanese could not see. In their excitement at pounding South Dakota, in the adrenaline rush of destroying American destroyers, the Japanese had lost their formation. Their ships were scattered, some pursuing South Dakota, some finishing off destroyers, some milling about in confusion, and none of them had noticed Washington. She had been hidden behind the burning wrecks, her radar signature masked by the surrounding carnage. Lee had an opportunity, but it would require doing something that violated every principle of battleship combat. He would have to charge alone into the middle of an enemy fleet. Lee gave the order that would define his place in naval history. Complete silence on all radio circuits. No lights, no communication with other ships. Maximum speed ahead. Washington accelerated and headed straight for the Japanese battle line. Her radar operators tracked every enemy ship, calling out ranges and bearings in whispers. The Japanese still had not seen her. Their searchlights were focused on South Dakota, now burning on the southern horizon. No one was looking for another battleship. At point-blank range for battleship guns, Lee gave the order to open fire on Kirishima. Washington's entire main battery erupted in a perfectly coordinated salvo. At that range, with radar fire control, with a stationary target illuminated by her own searchlights, Washington's gunners could not miss. The first salvo straddled Kirishima. The second was a direct hit. Then another and another. In just a few minutes, Washington fired dozens of 16-inch shells. At least 9, possibly many more, slammed into Kirishima. The effect was devastating. The shells punched through Kirishima's armor. One shell destroyed her forward turret, killing everyone inside instantly. Another detonated in her engine room, shattering turbines and boilers. A third hit below the waterline, opening a huge hole. Her steering gear was smashed, jamming her rudder. She began circling helplessly. While Washington continued to pound her, Washington's secondary battery joined the assault. Over 100 smaller shells slammed into Kirishima's superstructure, starting fires from stem to stern. Her pagoda mast was hit repeatedly. Her captain was wounded but remained at his post, trying desperately to save his ship. But there was nothing he could do. Kirishima was dying. Admiral Kondo, watching his flagship burn, faced the bitter reality that his force had been ambushed. He still did not know how many American ships he was facing. His cruisers turned their searchlights toward the source of the gunfire, finally illuminating Washington. They opened fire with their guns and launched a spread of Type 93 torpedoes, but Washington was already turning away, her radar tracking the torpedo spreads. Lee ordered a hard turn, and the giant battleship raced north at maximum speed. Every torpedo missed, some by only yards. The Japanese cruisers tried to pursue, but Lee was not running away. He was repositioning, using Washington's speed and radar to maintain optimal engagement range. As the range opened, Washington's guns shifted to the cruisers. Her first salvo straddled a heavy cruiser, sending columns of water over her bridge. Admiral Kondo, realizing he was now the hunted rather than the hunter, ordered immediate withdrawal. The most powerful Japanese surface force to approach Guadalcanal since the invasion began turned and fled into the night. Behind them, Kirishima was dying. Her list increased steadily as flooding spread. Damage control parties fought desperately, but it was hopeless. In the early hours of November 15th, her captain ordered abandon ship. The crew gathered on the slanting deck, sang the Japanese national anthem, gave 3 banzai cheers for the emperor, then went over the side. Kirishima rolled over and sank northwest of Savo Island. She took hundreds of her crew with her. She was the first battleship sunk by another battleship in the Pacific War, and she had been destroyed by a single American ship fighting alone. Lee wanted to pursue Kondo's retreating force, but he faced a new problem. American PT boats based at Tulagi could not tell friend from foe. Lee had to break radio silence to prevent being torpedoed by his own forces. His message to the PT boat base was characteristic of his personality. When challenged for recognition signals, Lee transmitted, "This is Ching, Lee. Get out of my way. I'm coming through." The PT boats wisely held their fire. As dawn broke, the full extent of the American victory became clear. Japanese troop ships that had been waiting to unload were caught in the open by aircraft from Henderson Field. Multiple transports were sunk. Only a fraction of the Japanese reinforcements reached shore, and they landed without most of their equipment and supplies. The final Japanese attempt to retake Guadalcanal had failed. The tide of the campaign had turned decisively in America's favor. The cost had been terrible. 3 American destroyers were lost with heavy casualties. Another was badly damaged. South Dakota would need months of repairs. In total, the United States Navy had lost multiple ships and suffered hundreds killed. But they had stopped the Japanese cold. Kirishima was on the bottom. The Japanese would never again send capital ships to Guadalcanal. The Marines would hold. The airfield would survive. When the casualty reports were compiled, one statistic stood out as almost unbelievable. USS Washington, which had single-handedly defeated a Japanese battleship and driven off an entire enemy fleet, had suffered no casualties. Not a single man aboard had been killed or seriously wounded by enemy action. The ship herself had taken only one minor hit. In the most violent surface engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign, the ship that had done the most damage had taken the least. It was unprecedented. Admiral Halsey's reaction was immediate and effusive. He sent a personal message to Lee that read, "You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history." But the official Navy response was more muted. The battle was classified as a defensive action, not the revolutionary offensive victory it really was. Lee's after-action report, which emphasized the critical importance of radar, was filed away with little comment. The battleship admirals did not want to admit that the carrier advocates had been wrong. The carrier admirals did not want to admit that battleships still had offensive value. So Washington's victory was minimized, treated as an anomaly. Lee himself was philosophical about the lack of recognition. He told his staff that the important thing was not credit, but results. Guadalcanal had been saved. That was enough. But privately, Lee was frustrated by the Navy's failure to learn from the battle. He wrote detailed reports on radar, directed fire control, and night fighting tactics. Most of his recommendations were ignored. The Navy was already moving on. The Japanese Navy's response to the defeat was confusion and denial. Admiral Kondo's initial report claimed that American cruisers and destroyers had sunk Kirishima. He could not believe that a single battleship had destroyed his flagship. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time in the war, a Japanese battleship had been defeated in surface combat. The Knight, which had belonged to the Japanese since Pearl Harbor, was no longer safe. Washington returned to port for minor repairs. Her crew was granted liberty, and for the first time they could talk about what they had accomplished. They had faced impossible odds and won. They had proved that American technology and training could overcome Japanese experience and numbers. They had turned the tide, but there was no time to celebrate. The war was far from over. Washington would go on to fight in many more campaigns. She would earn numerous battle stars, but she would never again have the opportunity to prove what she had proved that night off Guadalcanal. The Navy kept her tied to the carriers, using her massive anti-aircraft battery to protect them. Her 16-inch guns would fire thousands of rounds at shore targets. But she would never again engage an enemy warship. The tragedy was not that Washington was restricted to carrier escort duty. The tragedy was that the lessons of her victory were deliberately ignored. Lee had proved that battleships equipped with radar and trained in its use could dominate night surface combat. He had demonstrated tactics that could have saved lives in later battles. But the Navy bureaucracy, committed to the primacy of carrier aviation, refused to acknowledge these lessons. The revolution in surface warfare that Washington represented was stillborn. Lee himself continued to advocate for better integration of radar. He was later promoted and given command of the fast battleship force, but they remained tied to the carriers, forbidden to operate independently. Lee watched missed opportunities with growing frustration. He knew what his battleships could do if properly employed. He had proved it at Guadalcanal. Willis Augustus Lee Jr. died suddenly of a heart attack just days after Japan surrendered. The man who had revolutionized battleship warfare, who had saved Guadalcanal, died just as the war he had helped win came to an end. Washington was decommissioned after the war. Years later, she was sold for scrap. No effort was made to preserve her as a museum. No memorial was erected. The battleship that had saved Guadalcanal was reduced to razor blades and reinforcing bars. Today, decades after the battle, Washington's achievement remains largely unknown. But the legacy of Washington and Willis Lee lives on. The high-tech combat systems that protect modern American warships are direct descendants of the radar fire control system Lee pioneered. The integration of sensors and weapons that he advocated is now standard. The tactical principles he developed are the foundations of modern naval combat. There is one more piece of the Washington story that deserves telling. Throughout her entire combat career, through many major engagements, Washington never lost a single crew member to enemy action. There were accidents, but in actual combat, facing enemy guns, torpedoes, and aircraft, not one man was killed. No other major warship in any navy can make that claim. It speaks to the quality of her crew, the strength of her construction, and the tactical genius of Willis Lee, who understood that the best way to protect his men was to kill the enemy before the enemy could kill them. The story of USS Washington raises uncomfortable questions about military innovation and institutional resistance to change. It is a story that repeats itself throughout history. The service that adapts fastest to new technology, that listens to its operators over its bureaucrats, that values results over doctrine, will dominate future battles, just as Washington dominated that night off Guadalcanal. The physical traces of Washington are gone. Her crew have nearly all passed on, but their achievement endures in the principles they proved. Technology properly employed multiplies combat power. Training and tactics matter more than numbers. One ship with the right commander and the right tools can defeat an entire fleet. This November marks over 80 years since Washington proved that courage, technology, and leadership could overcome any odds. Her story reminds us that the greatest victories often come from the most unexpected sources, that bureaucracies resist change even when lives depend on it, and that the price of institutional blindness is always paid by those who serve. Washington deserves better than obscurity. Her crew deserves recognition. Willis Lee deserves his place among the great naval commanders. Most importantly, their lessons deserve to be studied, understood, and applied.